On behalf of the Church in the 21st Century Center and the Theology Department here at Boston College, I'd like to welcome you all to this afternoon's panel discussion on American Catholics and Election 2008 Issues of Conscience. Many of you may know that in advance of each election year since 1976, the U.S. bishops have issued a statement on the theme of faithful citizenship. The objective of these statements is to share with voters the insights that Catholic social teaching can bring to bear on issues facing the political community. In the wake of the controversies involving bishops, candidates, and communion during the 2004 election campaign, the 2008 edition of the Faithful Citizenship document was awaited with much anticipation. At their November 2007 meeting in Baltimore, the bishops approved the document that will be the subject of our discussion this afternoon. The document that our panelists will be discussing is entitled Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship, and it ultimately received the approval of 98% of the bishops in attendance at the bishops' November meeting. We're privileged to have a wonderful set of panelists with us today, and I'll introduce them now in alphabetical order. Maria Teresa Davila is Assistant Professor of Christian Ethics at the Andover Newton Theological School in Newton, Massachusetts. She's also taught at Boston College, Brandeis University, and Emmanuel College. Professor Davila received her bachelor's degree from Brown University, a master's in theological studies from Boston University, and her PhD in theological ethics is from Boston College. Her dissertation was entitled A Liberation Ethic for the One-Third World, the Preferential Option for the Poor and Challenges to Middle-Class Christianity in the United States. Professor Davila has two forthcoming books, Latina Ethics in a New Key from Baylor University Press and Ethics from a Hispanic Perspective from Abingdon Press, and she's the author of numerous publications and scholarly papers, including the contribution of Reinhold Niebuhr's Moral Ambiguity to Contemporary Discussions on the Morality of the Use of Force in a Post-Cold War World, published in the journal Political Theology. Alexia Kelly is the Executive Director and co-founder of Catholics in Alliance for the Common Good. She has a BA in Religion with honors from Haverford College and a Master's of Theological Studies from the Harvard Divinity School with a focus on Christianity and culture. Ms. Kelly has served in diverse capacities in nonprofit organizations committed to poverty reduction, social justice, and the environment. She worked for nearly a decade at the Catholic Campaign for Human Development, which is the Catholic Church's national anti-poverty program. Ms. Kelly is the co-editor of Living the Catholic Social Tradition, Cases and Commentary, published in 2004 by Sheed & Ward, and she's the co-author of a forthcoming book entitled A Nation for All, How the Catholic Vision of the Common Good Can Save America from the Politics of Division. She's also the author of Call to Family, Community, and Participation, part of a series of educational materials on Catholic social teaching published by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. Paul Manuel is Professor of Politics at St. Anselm College, where he chairs the Department of Politics and also serves as the Academic Research Director of the New Hampshire Institute of Politics. He has a BA in Political Science, summa cum laude, from Boston University, an MA in International Relations from Boston University, an MTS in Religion and Politics from the Weston Jesuit School of Theology in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and a PhD in Comparative Politics from Georgetown University. Professor Manuel writes on religion, politics, and democratization with a regional specialization in West Europe. He has authored or co-authored 5 books and numerous articles. Professor Manuel is a member of the National Screening Panel for the U.S. Graduate Fulbright Competition for the Spain and Portugal program, and a faculty affiliate at the Minda de Gunsberg Center for European Studies at Harvard University, where he co-chaired the Iberian Studies program for 6 years. Thomas Massaro is Professor of Moral Theology and Director of the Licentiate in Sacred Theology program at the Weston Jesuit School of Theology in Cambridge. Father Massaro received his PhD from Emory University. He teaches courses in Catholic social ethics and lectures frequently on topics involving the church and social justice. His research addresses the moral evaluation of American policies regarding domestic and international issues, including foreign policy, anti-poverty efforts, and globalization. Father Massaro is the author of many articles and 6 books, including United States Welfare Policy, A Catholic Response, Catholic Perspectives on Peace and War, and Living Justice, Catholic Social Teaching in Action. Father Reginald Witt is professor of law at the University of St. Thomas School of Law in Minneapolis, where he was a founding member of the faculty. He recently returned to St. Thomas after taking a leave in 2003 to serve as president of the pontifical faculty at the Dominican House of Studies. Father Witt received his bachelor's degree from Loyola College, his STB from the Pontifical Faculty of the Immaculate Conception, and his JD from the law school at Duke University. Father Witt also holds a doctorate in canon law from the Catholic University of America. Father Witt has taught on the law school faculties of Villanova University, the University of Kentucky, Duke University, and the University of Notre Dame. Known for his research in African American Catholic concerns, his 1990 article, Not Right Now, An African American Church, won first prize among original works from the Catholic Press Association. His other research interests include the ministry of bishops, liturgical law, and ecclesiastical structures, property, and governance. At St. Thomas, he teaches torts and the foundations of justice. We thought that for our discussion this afternoon, rather than having a series of set presentations from the panelists, we'd proceed through a series of hypothetical situations and more free-flowing conversation among the panelists about the Faithful Citizenship document. Since not all of you may have read the document, what I'll do is begin by pointing out a few highlights that I see in the document, and then invite the panelists through the course of the discussion to bring in things that they think are important that I may have left out. At the outset of this document, the bishops make it clear that their intention is not to tell people for whom or against whom to vote. For example, they say, our purpose is to help Catholics form their consciences in accordance with God's truth. We recognize that the responsibility to make choices in political life rests with each individual in light of a properly formed conscience, and that participation goes well beyond casting a vote in a particular election. Twice in the document, the bishops call for a different kind of politics, a different kind of political engagement. The Church calls for a different kind of political engagement, one shaped by the moral convictions of well-formed consciences and focused on the dignity of every human being, the pursuit of the common good, and the protection of the weak and the vulnerable. As Catholics, we should be guided more by our moral convictions than by our attachment to a political party or interest group. In the course of emphasizing the fundamental character of the Church's defense of the right to life, the bishops note that 2 temptations in public life can distort the Church's defense of human life and dignity. The first temptation is a moral equivalence that makes no ethical distinctions between different kinds of issues involving human life and dignity. The direct and intentional destruction of innocent human life from the moment of conception until natural death is always wrong and is not just one issue among many. It must always be opposed. The second temptation is the misuse of these necessary moral distinctions as a way of dismissing or ignoring other serious threats to human life and dignity. Racism and other unjust discrimination, the use of the death penalty, resorting to unjust war, the use of torture, war crimes, the failure to respond to those who are suffering from hunger or a lack of health care, or an unjust immigration policy, are all serious moral issues that challenge our consciences and require us to act. These are not optional concerns which can be dismissed. Interestingly, the bishops also recognize that decisions about voting and political life are complex and require the exercise of a well-formed conscience aided by the virtue of prudence. They recognize, for example, that prudential judgment is the art of the possible. We have to keep in mind what we can actually do in the given situation that we're in. While they don't want to tell people how to vote, the bishops do set forth some principles that should guide a person's decision about how to vote. The bishops stress that Catholics are not to be single-issue voters, But at the same time, a Catholic cannot vote for a candidate who takes a position in favor of an intrinsic evil, like abortion or racism, if the voter's intent is to support that position. At the same time, a voter should not use a candidate's opposition to an intrinsic evil to justify indifference or inattentiveness to other important moral issues involving human life and dignity. Sometimes there may be a requirement to vote for a candidate who isn't perfect in every respect, and the bishops recognize that to vote for a candidate deemed less likely to advance a morally flawed position and more likely to pursue other authentic human goods might be an appropriate response. In the end, the decision about voting is to be made by each Catholic guided by a conscience formed by Catholic moral teaching. Given that overview, you can see where the title of the document comes from, Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship. With that introduction to the document, I will pose a hypothetical for our panelists to think about. In the law school, we often place hypotheticals in an imaginary state called Grimes. Grimes is named after the professor who moderated the intramural moot court competition for many years. So imagine yourself in the state of Grimes. Imagine yourself as a bishop in the state of Grimes. You are the bishop in the Diocese of Grimes. As bishop, having come back from this meeting in Baltimore, where the bishops have adopted this document, what do you want to make sure that the people in your diocese understand about this document and their responsibilities in voting as they prepare to vote in the November elections in Grimes? Bishop Witt, what do you want your people to understand?
Yeah, you're it.
I'm in the minority that didn't vote for the document.
Why?
Actually, I'm not. No, I did vote for the document. And among other things, I want them to know everything that you listed. But there are two factors that you mentioned two sides of the same coin.
Two temptations?
Well, no. Actually, it's the second temptation and its practical application to voting. The second temptation is not to isolate the right to life issue. Abortion, euthanasia, even stem cell research, embryonic stem cell research. Not to isolate that to the point that it obviates considerations of all the other human dignity issues that are involved. And secondly, not to vote for a candidate, or to the other side, not to vote against a candidate simply because of the candidate's position on a right to life issue without looking at the entire panoply of human dignity issues in play. You take our current society in which, if we're not in a depression, we're maybe in a recession, and we're certainly in a state of panic, economic panic. For good or for ill, the issue of race has been brought into the presidential election campaign and addressed specifically by one of the candidates, which indicates that race is still a neuralgic issue, and as we know from the bishops, a human dignity issue.
An issue of intrinsic evil, interestingly enough.
An issue of intrinsic evil that Catholics may not ignore. So these things also must be looked upon when looking at an array of candidates, particularly at the presidential level, each of whom is compromised when it comes to matters of intrinsic evil.
Thank you, Bishop Witt. Bishop Keller, do you have anything to add? What would you want your people to understand?
Well, this is exciting. I think it's a fabulous opportunity. So if I was a bishop, I would say this is a great opportunity to convey Catholic social teaching. And so often in our contemporary, the media debates and all the hype and the kind of reductionist debates, certainly that rich tradition isn't always conveyed in its entirety and depth. So I think it's a great opportunity to convey that. The principle of the common good, too, and that vision of the common good, I think comes very strongly through the document and has been present in past documents as well. But I'd say it's very robust in this particular version. And I've heard a lot of, bishops and other Catholics say who've, traveled some, that in the church, the global church, the sense of the common good is stronger than it is in the American church or among American people, that we have such a, focus on the individual and individual success, and that's important, that self-reliance is important to our American character, but what the Catholic Church can contribute in terms of this understanding of the common good, I think is unique, and so I would be excited that this is a great opportunity to convey that. I think also, just to third the point about these other issues that have been noted as intrinsically evil and unacceptable, racism, torture, genocide, the targeting of non-combatants in war or acts of terror are not just unacceptable, they're never to be allowed, and they're called intrinsically evil as abortion and euthanasia are as well. So I think that's very expansive and powerful for people to understand.
One thing all the bishops might want to consider is how you would build on what Bishop Kelly started off with, saying this is a great opportunity to share Catholic social thought, Catholic social teaching. How are you going to do that? I was talking to my mom on Easter, and I said I was going to be moderating this panel about this document that the bishops had put out, and she said, well, should I have seen that? I don't remember seeing anything in the diocesan paper about it. So how should we share this with people? How do we take this opportunity to share Catholic social thought, Catholic social teaching with people?
Can we do?
If you want to start, but I'd be happy to hear from the
well,
other
it's sort of a distribution publicity question, too. I was reading some of the news reports, and I think they distributed in 2004 maybe close to 400,000 copies, is that right? Which is not a lot when you consider there's 65 million Catholics. So certainly, I think just in a practical way, the PDF bulletin insert is the thing that people want to get in parishes. That's the 2-pager. But I think there are creative ways. I mean, social justice committees, I think pastors and pastoral associates and social justice committees could be taking this up and having lively debates, having panel discussions like this. People could be getting out in the mainstream media, on the blogs, everywhere, I think, engaging in this debate in sort of contemporary media formats.
Other thoughts on that?
I would take it even beyond Catholic social teaching. One of the things that I would like my faithful to know in my diocese is that it actually covers the whole span of moral teaching of the Catholic Church. It talks about virtue ethics, about developing conscience, about developing prudence, then about the common good and the pillars, 7 or it could be 9, however you want to number the pillars of Catholic social teaching, and then how that forms an in toto of a moral tradition that spans 2,000 years or over 2,000 years. So it's a great opportunity to engage in a dialogue that moves the person from the personal to the communal. I mean, it uncovers all the different circles of faithful activity and of the believers' circles of influence. So that's in terms of the point you had raised. I think there's one more aspect that I really would like to applaud in the document and convey, which is, as Bishop Wood was mentioning, the whole spectrum of life that it covers. It's talking about the rights of the unborn, maybe excessively so, or maybe in a dominant way, but also the rights of the non-human, which is something that liberation theology has spoken about, those who are voiceless, who by poverty or by being immigrants or by being victims of war, are human lives that are also being lost and that are also being acted violently upon. So it's a way of getting vocabulary out there with which parishioners, the faithful, can begin a dialogue or continue or further their own dialogue as to how they're going to approach their interaction with the body politics. And one thing that I'm sure was left out, even though I insisted on it on the meetings, was that tag along at the end for ecumenical visions of this, and for this to be an entry point for Catholics to then engage in cooperative work with other Christians and other people of faith in the U.S. on the issues of transforming society to a more humane, for a more human country. So that was left out, but it's in the spirit of the document, I'm sure, to engage it with other Christian denominations.
You know, sometimes when priests are in the pulpit and they preach about these sorts of issues, their parishioners will sometimes say, I don't want that politics stuff coming into church. And I was reading the newspaper in Grimes the other day, and a political science professor at the State University in Grimes read this faithful citizenship document, and then she wrote an op-ed in the paper that took the following position. There those bishops go again. This is just another blatant example of the bishops sticking their nose into politics in a way that's not appropriate in a country where there's supposed to be a separation of church and state. What do those bishops know about politics anyway? Bishop Manuel? You've accepted the paper's invitation to write a responsive op-ed to this political science professor. What are you going to say?
I would stipulate and move on. That's what I would do. No, I think the first response would be, it's a very simple one. This is the fruit of ongoing reflection following Vatican II. This is not catechism. This is not an effort to catechize citizens. In fact, one of the I read through it, and inappropriately so. I don't think it was overstated. I counted 17 references to sanctity of life issues in a 30-page document. Unborn, cloning, what have you. So there's the question of intrinsic evil is there. So there's not a retreat on the question of intrinsic evil, and it says that we're not single-issue voters, and the bishops, but it's not telling people how to vote. So in terms of the bishops getting involved in politics, no. It's an opportunity to reflect upon what it is to be an informed, ethical person in this Christian tradition. But one of the issues that sort of quietly coming through, that I think, this is an ongoing process, this Vatican II business, is the bishop's insistence that people have to make up their own minds. Freedom of religion is essential to this document. So it's the Catholic saying, from our tradition and upon our reflection, these are intrinsic evils. There are many issues, but these are intrinsic evils, and these are things we have to be concerned about. But you have to make up your own mind. I think that's an extraordinary affirmation of the individual's relationship with the Creator, and that in the end, when you're at the pearly gates, it's not going to be sufficient to say I voted because the bishops wanted me to, but I voted this way because through my own discernment I got to that point. And so I think that's absolutely fundamental to this. And I would just add that as I was running through sort of what I would propose, I think what they're proposing in this, what the bishops propose, is something, a hierarchy of evils. Society is full of evils. And as voters, you have to run through them, you have to make up your mind. And the top one, from what I could discern as a political scientist, would be sanctity of life issues, starting with abortion. That's the fundamental issue. Not the only one, but fundamental one. And then structural sin, questions of poverty or other sorts of oppressions. But in the secondary position, but also intrinsic, but human life, the protection of the vulnerable as the top. At least from what I was able to discern in my counting, I found that to be the case. Then we get to questions of war, but we do have a tradition in the Catholic Church of just and unjust war. So be careful about war, but it's hard these days to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Then questions related to the death penalty that we're against, but it's different than abortion. And then cultural issues, marriage and whatnot. It's there, but it's of a tertiary element. So it reads a lot like Scripture itself. You can pick and choose, but the message throughout is life is important, sanctity of life is important, God is telling us something, and through discernment we have to listen.
It's interesting you mentioned the pearly gates there a minute ago. And in section 38 of the documents, the bishops say this: it's important to be clear that political choices faced by citizens not only have an impact on general peace and prosperity, but also may affect the individual's salvation. Similarly, the kinds of laws and policies supported by public officials affect their spiritual well-being. What does that mean?
It's in Bentham he taught us about the hedonistic calculus. The bishops have given us a Catholic calculus. You may vote for a candidate who you know to be in favor of abortion, as long as you yourself are against abortion. So, in other words, you may vote for that candidate if there's a larger evil that the candidate will combat. Say, is a candidate who's, again, is going to pursue, a sort of peace in the world and anti-poverty legislation and tackle other sorts of intrinsic evils, but is also going to push, get the Supreme Court go in another direction and be in favor of abortion. So you may vote for that person for all those other reasons, but your personal salvation requires you to say abortion is wrong and fight for it in other capacities. And so there's a Catholic calculation that seems to be contradictory, but it's not.
Bishop Kelly, did you want to get in there? You've got a look on your face like you want to get in there.
No, just to further that point, I think a lot of it involves intent, too. Is it the voter's intent that their vote for this candidate will further abortion or will reduce abortion?
Am I voting for that candidate
Right.
because I intend to further abortion?
Right. So it has a
Rather
lot to
than
do
in
with the
spite of their
voter's
position.
intent.
That's right. The voter's intent is key in this document when you're assessing whether they're cooperating improperly in the wrongdoing of a public official. Bishop Massaro, what kind of voting decision is going to put my salvation at risk? We've talked about this kind of maybe formal cooperation in a policy that's promoting abortion. But let's say I'm not voting for somebody because they're going to provide public funding for abortion, but what other kinds of things might put my salvation at risk?
Well, I mean, the very mention, and you did well to choose paragraph 38, that's where the rubber does begin to hit the road. Well, what that paragraph does, more clearly than any other paragraph in the document, is set the Catholic social teaching message against the larger backdrop of the nature of our faith. And I think we need to back up a little bit and say some basic things. I think it comes as a surprise to most Catholics. Never underestimate the fact that this message has not gotten out. Many Catholics are surprised to hear that politics has anything to do with faith. They kind of hermetically seal these compartments of their lives. So just to make the basic point that your voting behavior, and by the way, broader political participation behavior, writing letters to members of Congress, etc., what happens between elections counts too. But many people are surprised to hear anything. So I would just use that word remedial. I think the purpose of a document like this, most of what happens is basic remedial, drawing connections, making a linkage, connecting the dots. The bishops have been doing this, as you said, since the 70s. Some people collect trading cards or stamps. I collect bishop statements. I've got a collection from the 90s and early 2000s. Some of them are thick, some of them are thinner. Even, the little bulletin inserts. Even the bulletin insert that the bishops include at the end of their statement is 10 pages of double-spaced text. That's a thicker bulletin than I've ever seen in my parishes. But, okay, I think the basic message of getting people to think about the issues that each of the panelists have raised, the issue of conscience, informing your conscience, key issues like respect for life, maybe more peripheral issues. I don't want to call the environment peripheral, but it's not the first thing you think of.
One of the 10 key issues that they name in the document.
And it's the latest, it's the most recent. The greening of the Vatican is probably the most recent development in Catholic social thought. So before we go too far down the road, I just want to bring those up. And let me close with this. I spent a lot of my time doing two things. One, teaching advanced graduate seminars at a seminary in Cambridge on these topics. Very often people arrive, having gone through 2 years of theological education and maybe 4 years of an undergraduate theology major, barely conversant, barely aware that these issues are part of theology. So that initial task that we mentioned of putting these against the background, what kind of a faith do we have? It's got a transcendent dimension, but it has that immanent, that in the dirt, in the muck and mire, that connection too. The other thing I do is I go around the country, mostly locally, but sometimes nationally. I've probably spoken in dozens of dioceses by now, talking about these issues, and it's always the majority of people, it's the first they're hearing that bishops care about political or economic issues, which is tragic.
Yeah,
but we need to do remedial work.
Yeah.
Bishop Witt.
To go back to the response to the columnist. There go those bishops again,
Yeah.
getting involved in politics.
What business of theirs?
Ever read the First Amendment? Congress shall make no law abridging the free exercise of religion. This is an exercise of religion for Catholics. The document, paragraph 9, starts, the Church's obligation to participate in shaping the moral character of society is a basic part of the mission we have received from Jesus Christ. Going to Mass, going to confession, giving to charities, yes, that's all the exercise of religion, but so is the way in which you exercise your citizenship.
So it's a basic part of our faith, exercising citizenship comes out of our commitment to discipleship. It's also interesting, I think, in this context, that Americans often get the First Amendment issues confused. And they would say, well, this is bishops talking about politics, there's something wrong with that. First Amendment says Congress shall make no law.
Right.
It doesn't say the church shall not speak on these issues.
Right.
So it's important to recognize that the church has got a role to play in voicing these issues.
And in fact, the framers consecrated the political exercise of religion on the part of citizens and shielded it from the government's oppression. That's the point of the First Amendment.
As witnesses, we have an obligation, and as citizens, we have an obligation to do this. But putting the church, but our relationship with politics historically has been problematic, and this is where Vatican II is useful. I mean, Pope Paul VI had an awful time extricating the church from its relationship with Franco. The big fight was over the appointment of bishops, and will Vatican II be approved? And Franco had his own right to choose his own bishops, and there was a huge battle. So at the same time, as Americans, we look at it from a particular point of view, but lots of bishops are writing these documents in different contexts. And so I think one of the reasons that the church has to be very careful in how it engages politics is precisely because of that fear. We are witnesses. We have a set of ethical guidelines that we're speaking for. We're not saying vote for this party or for that. You can make up your own mind. But that's also the lived experience of the church. I mean, I'm a political scientist. I work in New Hampshire. I was frequently questioned about this document. And so when pushed, I said, well, then Catholics, the only candidate you can vote for is Mike Huckabee, the non-Catholic, because he's got this economic populist stuff, fits into social justice, and he's pro-life. So he's the only one. And they looked at me sort of bemused and said, I know, he's not Catholic, but that would be the one. But I mean, I wouldn't actually recommend anyone to vote for any candidate, but reflect and discern. And I think that's an obligation we have.
I think the document too makes a great case around the responsibility of the laity to engage in public life and political participation, and I think that's very empowering for lay people. And they pick up a lot of statements that Pope Benedict XVI makes in his first encyclical, God is Love, about lay participation and kind of the distinction, the role of the state and the role of the church, and I think he reestablishes or just clarifies some important boundaries, that the church isn't responsible for forming a just society, but the church is responsible for forming the consciences of its lay faithful, who then participate and engage in society. So I think that's an important distinction and point. Just one other comment about the peace. I know some folks very involved in the peace movement who are always advocating for the ninth theme or principle of Catholic social teaching. We need to pull out the peace, commitment to peace, as a separate theme and category, and so they might be disappointed that it gets collapsed in, I think, the solidarity principle. But there's some powerful statements in the document about conscientious subjection. I think it's paragraph 67. Our church honors the commitment and sacrifice of those who serve in our nation's armed forces, but also recognizes the moral right to conscientious subjection to war in general, a particular war, or a military procedure, which I thought was fairly radical.
The affirmation of selective conscientious objection goes much farther than American law allows. So, I mean, it's an interesting point where there's room for more thinking and advocacy. There's a very complex question about how the law would accommodate selective conscientious objection, but it's a key thing.
Actually, on that as well, the old distinctions between combatants and non-combatants, which make up the crux of Catholic just war thinking, has been obliterated in the 20th century. Ken Himes, I heard him give a talk a little while ago. World War I, 5% of deaths were non-combatants. Deaths were part of that war. Gulf War, this one, 95% of deaths are non-combatant deaths. With it, all war, the new technologies, the way that war is being fought. So the distinctions that have so guided us in thinking about war, when I say us, the church and just war, I think have been obliterated, and so it might be a time for a reconsideration of that premise. Not that war never can be waged, but the way that it has to be waged, the way we have to think about it is very different. We still have these neat categories, and I don't think, well, the facts don't bear those categories anymore.
The realities of what happens in combat.
Right. I mean, going to war, you have to anticipate that most people that will be killed are not going to be combatants, they're going to be non-combatants. And then the question would be, would the evil that going to war, that evil, be justified by the ends? And we don't believe in ends justifying means in our tradition. So this is a tough one.
If a voter in your diocese came to you and said, in thinking about voting this fall, I'm concerned about this issue of non-combatant death, and I'm concerned about how many Iraqis have died in the last 5 years. How do I take that into account in thinking about voting?
Well, one of the tools, again, applauding the way that the document presents the tools of the tradition to the faithful so that they can make discernment, that one of where it says, the art of the possibility, or the art of the possible, and reading through in what they label as evils, etc., I think that a parishioner that comes with that question, I may feel more empowered, or with the possibility of empowering them to transform society with respect to an issue such as torture, versus the possibility of transforming society on an issue such as abortion by their vote. So that issues of torture, issues of war, issues of death penalty are places where the voter has more possibility with the vote. There's other places, like others have mentioned here, where abortion can be addressed and advocated against, and structures put in place for the safety of women, or safety nets of women in crisis situations and families in crisis situations. But in terms of where a faithful can put their vote, I think it can more effectively address issues of war and torture, etc., and those issues of life, than on the other issues that they have been mentioning before.
Why do you think that? Why more effective?
Well, in looking at some of, this is not my analysis, but commentaries on the document have raised the point that there have been a series of precedents in the past 20 years who have been against abortion, and have any of them made a significant move to eradicate or take abortion, or remove it from, or the right for an abortion, to remove it from our legal system? No. In fact, that those moves haven't been serious moves. They have been mainly rhetoric, and yet those same candidates have made moves in terms of war and in terms of our attitudes towards the international scenario, where we are actors as well. So mainly from experience, I guess, we can say that a Catholic who is wants to, in good conscience, worried about the deaths of a war, want to do something about it, that they have a possibility by voting, putting that, maybe altering the hierarchy of evils because of the plane of possibilities, because of the realm of possibilities. So not altering the hierarchy of evils in what it is in doctrine, but altering it in terms of what it is possible.
How likely is it that voting for X candidate is going to lead to the result that I want on this issue? What would you say, or any of the panelists, how would you respond to somebody who says, we just need one more justice to change the precedent on?
Dream on.
Yeah.
It's not that simple.
Say more.
It's not that simple.
Why not?
Well, because of the word she used, precedent. The Supreme Court, if you have a properly conservative justice sitting on that court, that justice will believe he or she is bound by precedent. It is not going to seek to radically overturn the established law of the United States.
But we've overturned precedents before.
Well, look how long it took to overturn Plessy, if Plessy was overturned. I've always taught my students that Plessy against Ferguson is still the law of the land, except with respect to public schools. To overturn Roe v. Wade takes more than a single justice voting. Because even the justices who currently run the court, and let's recognize it, the majority of justices on the court now are Catholics. There are 5 Catholics on the court. They just yesterday refused a cert petition with respect to an abortion appeal. The law has its own rules and its own culture and its own life. And one more justice is not going to bring about a radical change in abortion law in the United States with respect to the court's own precedents.
So thinking about voting in a way that is pro-life has to go beyond saying, what does this candidate say about who they'll appoint to the
Well,
Supreme
frankly,
Court?
to go back to something else she mentioned, it's the issue of the art of the possible. I will say on behalf of the current president, he did sign partial birth abortion legislation, and this court has found a means of upholding it. Congress's second attempt at a federal partial birth abortion law. But it's a matter of inches, if not centimeters, if not millimeters, with respect to changing abortion law at the level of courts, and even getting legislation that permits the courts to acknowledge a change in abortion law. Right to life issues simply are more varied and broader. Bishops point that out in this document. We have a lot of other issues that need to be addressed, some of which are a lot more present to us and a lot more pressing upon us. Housing, education, immigration, race. These, along with embryonic stem cell research, cloning, abortion, euthanasia, the status and meaning of marriage, are all in play.
Now, T mentioned torture before.
Yeah.
What if one of your faithful comes to you, Bishop Massaro, and says, I think the war on terror is the most important issue. And I really think that I need to vote for this senatorial candidate in Grimes who says he's going to push legislation that will authorize the use of coercive interrogation techniques, including waterboarding, because we really need that to get the information that we need to be successful in the war on terror. Can I, in good conscience, vote for that candidate for that reason?
The person needs more than a piece of advice. I think the first thing I would underline, it sounds trite, but just to say, look, the single weapon of voting is too blunt an instrument to send a signal, well misguided or not, regarding this candidate. When you cast a vote for a candidate, and I liked Professor Manuel's example of Mike Huckabee, because he's not in the race, so it's easy to do, right? You're sending signals over a whole range of things. I'm far more interested in the political participation that happens between elections. On the issue of abortion, for example, so much attention is focused on the legal strategy and the counting votes on the Supreme Court, cases that may never reach them, and even if they do, it's not clear with legal precedents, the argument about settled law, etc.
And even if they overturn the precedent, what happens
to the states
legislatively in trying to enact?
What we lose sight of when we focus narrowly on the legal strategy is the cultural strategy, which is let's build a culture, a consensus around life in the broadest sense. One of my disappointments with this document, I have some problems with the document on tone and style, and it kind of forecloses debate where I think it should be opening up debate in a pluralistic society. Those are significant reservations. I would love to have seen far more treatment of Cardinal Bernardin, the late Cardinal Bernardin's, it's only a catchphrase, but it means so much, the consistent ethic of life. Only in paragraph 40 is it mentioned substantially. I would have loved to have seen that, as some previous versions of this quadrennial pre-election statement have made a higher profile for that. If we could talk on the cultural level, I think we would avoid the mistake of narrowly focusing on what it means to cast a vote at this moment. Not every election is about abortion. Not every election is about torture. Not every election is about the war. Every election is about all of those things. And so narrowly focusing on the instrument of voting is simply too blunt.
Why do you think the language has changed? I mean, it is striking, I think, how the diminishment in reference to the consistent ethic of life has developed over the years. I was teaching last week the 1993 document that was celebrating the 83 Peace Pastoral, and there's a couple of really striking sections in there where the bishops talk very explicitly about the consistent ethic, and they tie together abortion and the death penalty and issues of war and peace and domestic violence and all of these things very effectively. Why have they left that behind?
Well, just briefly, that document, The Harvest of Justice is Sown in Peace, came out at the height of Cardinal Bernardin's influence over the body of the Bishops' Conference. His death in the fall of 1996. And since then, the Common Ground Initiative that he championed has fallen upon hard times for a number of political reasons. We don't need to go into them. So it has a lot to do with the personality of Cardinal Bernardin, among others.
I was relieved that it was mentioned once. So, I mean, I heard some people saying, oh, you know, they'll completely leave it behind. It won't be, there's no more consistent ethic of life, you know, framework language. So I think it's important that it's there.
You know,
If I could, just in terms of the conversation, I think what this document suffers from is the same problem that libertarians suffer from. Libertarians don't have a natural constituency. There's a principle, and that principle says, well, we want low taxes, so Republicans like that, and we want to get out of Iraq, and Democrats like that. There's no natural constituency. We did a poll at the Institute of Politics in New Hampshire, and we found that 7% of the people liked Ron Paul, and stayed 7%, and so 7% natural, they're not going to win. But they're not about winning, they're about engaging the culture on this ethic. Likewise, faithful citizenship, a Catholic approach. We talk about sanctity of life issues and we talk about social justice issues. There's not a natural constituency. Some are going to be Republican, some are going to be Democrat. I did just a quick count through the 10 major issues, and I found 3.5 for the Republicans and 6.5 for the Democrats. And that's not telling us, okay, therefore you can vote Democrat. It's not saying that at all. You could, but you could, for good reason, vote Republican as well, depending on the issue. And with that, I just wanted to reflect on the tragedy of President Bush, because I think that also speaks to the bishop's point about it's not about one individual. It's about, and Thomas Sauer's point about culture, in the sense that this president, you know, we used to say that only Nixon could go to China. And I found it ironic that only President Bush could go to the Vatican and spend time with John Paul. And that speech that we all forgot about that happened just before 9/11 on the sanctity of life issues and the culture of life was a beautiful speech about when he was going to stop, you know, not fund cloning and stem cell research. But it was a beautifully thoughtful speech, and it was through his reflections of talking to the Pope, and then 9/11 happens. And then what does he do? He talks about culture of life, and then he does things like he attacks AIDS in Africa in a way that no administration had ever done before. He upgrades the Office of Prevention of Human Trafficking from a directorship to an ambassador, and they've been very aggressive at stopping sex trafficking, because most of it comes from this country, and the administration has been acting on that. And at the same time, it's launched perhaps the most horrific war in our history, with incredible non-combatant death and horrible tragedies that we're going to be living with for the rest of our lives. And so there's a tragedy of putting all your eggs in one basket, or saying there are some good things that this administration has done on the culture of life, and they should be acknowledged. But the larger question, this war has been a disaster on the culture of life, and that needs to be. And so I think, in a sense, when we're looking at this document, we have to understand that it's not about voting for a particular candidate, it's about changing the culture. If Roe v. Wade is overturned, then Massachusetts and New York and other states are going to allow abortion to take place in their states. Well, the simple thing that Roe v. Wade will do is say it's not a federal mandate anymore. It's not going to eliminate abortion. It's going to kick it back to the states. And so if we really want abortion to be eliminated, we have to change the culture. And I think that's what this is trying to do.
I think it'd be interesting, too, and maybe some of the professors of Catholic social teaching know the answer to this question, but comparing what the Vatican has said in recent years, in particular, and Catholic social teaching in general. I have read through the compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church, which they put out about 4 years ago, the Justice and Peace Commission at the Vatican. But I think in some cases, when you read this document, the Faithful Citizenship document from the U.S. bishops, and then look at what the Vatican has articulated on Catholic social teaching, the Vatican is often stronger, I think, certainly on social justice, sometimes on peace, and at least the vision of the common good and the theme of the common good that comes out, for example, in the compendium and some of the other encyclicals, there's a more holistic sense, I think, a sense or tone that comes out in those documents, and a sense of interconnectedness of the social justice issues with the culture of life issues, that they're not sort of, well, yes, this is kind of a both-and document. They're both good, and that's, you know, people talk say that that's the tone coming out of the USCCB. I mean, it's a both-and. I've heard people say, you know, there's something for everyone, but is it as interconnected as some of the documents that the Vatican has issued recently? I asked that as a question.
I'll just offer this. The document that's in front of us, the Faithful Citizenship document, lacks a vision of the common good that's appealing. I'm borrowing that phrase from my colleague Dave Hollenbach, who's in the room right now. It doesn't portray a vision. Other U.S. bishops' documents did. Economic Justice for All back in the 80s, the high point of bishops' involvement in public life. Even the compendium is only a resource. Yeah, it's just a reference book. But the best of the encyclicals also offer a resource. I'll just close with this comment. The Catholic voice is the single most communitarian voice commonly heard in the United States. We're a very individualistic society. A Vatican statement about the common good and our community life is usually stronger than one that comes from inside that individualistic culture, as the U.S. bishops do.
So it's a matter of translation from
a wider vision to a more individualistic culture, and how do we speak that language here?
However, there are some places where for this culture and this context, it is a bold statement. I think the section on immigration may be common sense to certain circles, but really to the wider Catholic population in the U.S., it does come as very bold to strictly say, you know, shorter paths to citizenship, seasonal worker programs, etc., you know, keeping the unity of the family, etc. Those are things that are critical in this election, that is in people's minds, and that people are not clear about the Catholic position. Even when I'm teaching Catholic social teaching, when I get to this point, people who have been with me throughout all the visions of common good and all the visions of justice and war and peace, etc., when I get to immigration, they do not want to hear it. You know, you come here through the legal means, you work your way, and that's the American way. And so even for people who know, I'm talking about undergrad students in different Catholic universities, who know Catholic social teaching and subscribe to it, even the option for the poor, when it comes to the issue of immigration, they would not like this as it's written here. So it does offer some bold notions.
I wonder if there's an issue of language in the whole, or how the document speaks, how the church speaks in this culture that's related, Tom, to what you were saying before, and maybe connects up with how do we get to the immigration issue and other things. This document may speak more in terms of here's what we teach. You need to listen to what we teach, rather than saying here's the vision of the common good. Do you see this whole vision of the common good as being coherent? Is that maybe something that's going on? Thoughts on that?
I think it goes deeper than that. I think the bishops are telling the society, this is how God wants us to live. Think about why were we created? And it mentions, you know, the Word, and the flesh, and you know, it becomes man. How are we supposed to live? How do we fulfill our obligations? And then being a citizen is simply a vehicle through which we live in the way that's pleasing to God. And so the reflection back and all the bold statements reflect, it's not us being bold, it's God telling us how to live. And so the challenge is coming from that. Love you. Why do we welcome the stranger? Because it pleases Christ. That's why. Why do we love the vulnerable? Because it pleases God. You know, I remember years ago at Weston Jesuit, I was in Father Massaro's class, and he used to say, I work with a liberal progressive all the time, but the one thing I bring to the table is they want to help the poor, and I can tell them why. And I said, why? And he said, because it pleases God. And that stayed with me all these years. And I think so in a sense, it's not just, you know, gee whiz, we think this and you think that, and sort of a relativistic calculation, and let's all just, you know, hold hands. No, this is serious stuff. It's hard to know what God wants, but we have a sense because He told us.
I don't remember saying that, but
you said it.
Grounding our beliefs in a narrative, that's where it's at. That is what we can add. The problem with a document like this, you know, it's just a limited thing. Part 2 is simply a laundry list. I counted 49, they're in bold, 49 issues that come up. You might count them slightly differently. So you really can't do too much storytelling or narrative. We have a cosmology. We have a reason for living and a view of the universe and redemption and salvation and where it's going, a teleology, a destination point. That's hard to convey in a political document. Partially successful.
But somehow keying people into that and asking them, inviting them to bring that into their discernment about how they vote and how they participate in political life between elections is really key. I don't want this to end without offering the opportunity to people in the audience to ask questions of our panelists. So if there are people.